Well, across the globe, journalists have found themselves increasingly in the line of fire, whether it's as the target of political rhetoric, labeling them enemies of the people, or as a target of very real violence in repressive regimes. A bigger picture, it comes from a new annual survey from Reporters Without Borders, which shows both some positive and some negative trends.
Right. The relatively good news is that the number of journalists killed in connection with their work dropped to 49 in 2019 from 87 the year before. And that, in fact, was the lowest this decade. But a worrying number, 389 reporters detained. That is a 12% increase over 2018. Pauline Adesmevel is a spokeswoman for Reporters Without Borders, joining us now from Paris. Pauline, talk to us about what accounts for those shifts, for better and for worse.
Well, the number of 49 journalists killed is still a very bad news, but we also welcome this new data showing that the rise has stopped, and we can see that less journalists are killed on the ground. What is interesting with this new number of 49 journalists is also that 59% of these journalists have been killed in countries at peace and not at war, which means that in countries, in democratic countries, or in countries where there is no war, no conflict, journalists are at risk as much as in countries in conflict zone. And so this is one of the particular points that we made with this new roundup.
Right, and as we said, Pauline, the number of journalists being detained is rising. But let's take a look at where the trend is especially notable. Nearly half of the world's imprisoned journalists are being held in just 3 countries: China, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. China alone holding a third of the world's imprisoned journalists. So talk to us a little about the situation there, especially in China.
Well, the data are very impressive. You're right. It's the double of last year. 120 journalists are under bars in China. We had 60 journalists imprisoned last year. So the number has doubled because the regime is more and more repressive. What we see on the ground is that journalists who are trying to witness what's going on, for example, the Uyghur situation, the concentration camps that the regime doesn't want the world to know about, are really at risk and are pressurized. And these journalists are not necessarily those that are backed up by newsroom, etc. They are citizen journalists, journalists using the social networks to get this information known outside China. And they are very, very pressurized. They are threatened and they are put in jail. So this is extremely worrying because we need to know this information, and journalists are taking big risk to inform us.
Pauline, there's obviously a very big difference between the reality in countries like China or here in the Middle East and Syria, for that matter, and democracies. But at the same time, we do see rhetoric from the U.S., no less, from President Trump, for example, that journalists are enemies of the people. Is that something on your radar in a report like this? Is that something sparking concern?
Yes, absolutely. I think this is a question, an issue we raised in our last index in April, and this is something we are still also mentioning. The fact that journalists are threatened or more targeted by regime and also facing difficulties while they cover demonstration, while they are on the ground, is also part of this, a consequence of this rhetoric. While an official in a country, a leader, a political leader, starts stigmatizing, insulting journalists, it is a kind of a white check for the population, for those on the ground, to not respect the journalists and to insult them as well. So necessarily we ask the leaders, the officials, not to criticize, not to insult journalists in the way they do in certain countries, because it has an impact on the ground for the population, which believe that she is entitled to treat the journalist in this way.
Pauline, I did notice in talking about journalists being imprisoned, we're talking more about journalists within their own native countries as opposed to, say, foreign correspondents taking hostages. Is there maybe a danger here that even we in the media don't pay enough attention to these cases? If it's a foreign correspondent abroad, it gets a lot of publicity. It becomes a sort of cause célèbre. But if it's a local journalist, maybe there's not enough attention being paid.
Yes, that's true. I think the problem is that foreign journalists leave the ground or decide not to cover some stories, and we of course have to ask and to deal with local journalists who do a super job on the ground. But it says a lot about the fact that we won't hear as much stories because there won't be this international echo when international journalists are not on the ground. And it's also extremely worrying because these local journalists are put at risk by covering this. And of course, in some countries, like as you mentioned, it's easier to imprison a local journalist than an international journalist whose detention will be echoed everywhere out through the world.
All right, Pauline Desmevel, thank you so much for being with us.